Imagine compressing more than 4,000 years of human history into a single story. A story filled with creation and destruction, kings and shepherds, miracles and disasters, faith and rebellion. The Old Testament is not merely a collection of ancient writings. It is one continuous narrative, stretching from the beginning of the universe to the silence that came before the birth of Christ. Across dozens of generations, countless wars, and entire civilizations rising and falling, one theme remains constant: a promise. A promise that survives paradise lost, a worldwide flood, slavery, exile, and the collapse of kingdoms. How could books written across centuries by different authors tell a story that feels so connected from beginning to end? Tonight we follow that story. From the first light that pierced the darkness, to the final prophet who spoke before 4 centuries of silence. This is the entire history of the Old Testament, and it begins before history itself existed. In the beginning, there was nothing. No stars, no planets, no time, and no space. Then God spoke, "Let there be light." According to Genesis, creation unfolded in a deliberate sequence. Light appeared, the heavens were formed, land emerged from the waters, vegetation covered the earth. The sun, moon, and stars took their places in the sky. Fish filled the seas, birds filled the air, animals spread across the land. Finally, God created humanity. Unlike every other creature, mankind was made in the image of God. Adam was formed from the dust of the ground, and God breathed life into him. Later, Eve was created to stand beside him as his companion. Their home was Eden, a paradise without suffering, death, or fear. At its center stood 2 trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Only one command existed: do not eat from the forbidden tree. But a serpent introduced doubt where trust once existed. Eve ate the fruit. Adam followed. In that moment, innocence vanished. Shame entered the human experience. Sin entered the world. Death became reality. Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, and humanity's long struggle began. Their sons, Cain and Abel, soon revealed how deeply the damage had spread. Abel's offering pleased God. Cain's did not. Consumed by jealousy, Cain murdered his brother. The first family became the scene of the first murder. Generations passed. Human civilization expanded, yet violence and corruption multiplied even faster. One man stood out from the growing darkness. His name was Enoch. The Bible says he walked with God and was taken away without experiencing death. But Enoch was the exception. The world itself continued to deteriorate. Humanity became increasingly violent, selfish, and corrupt. Genesis describes a civilization where evil dominated every aspect of life. God looked upon the earth and grieved over what humanity had become. A judgment was coming. Yet amid the corruption, one man remained faithful: Noah. God instructed Noah to build an enormous ark, not a ship designed for exploration, but a vessel designed for survival. For years, Noah built while warning others of what was coming. Few listened, most likely laughed. Then the day arrived. Animals entered the ark. Noah and his family stepped inside, and God closed the door. Rain fell. Waters burst from beneath the earth. Floods covered mountains and valleys alike. The old world disappeared beneath the water. Only Noah, his family, and the creatures aboard the ark survived. For months, they drifted upon a world transformed by judgment. Eventually, Noah released a dove. It returned carrying an olive leaf. Life was returning. Hope remained. When the waters receded, Noah stepped onto dry land and built an altar in gratitude. Then God established a covenant with all humanity. The rainbow became its sign. a reminder that despite human failure, God had not abandoned his creation. But the story was far from over. Humanity would soon repeat many of the same mistakes. And from among the scattered nations of the earth, one man would be called to begin a new chapter. A man named Abraham. After the flood, Noah's descendants spread across the earth and formed the first nations. But humanity once again drifted toward pride. On the plains of Shinar, people united to build a city and a tower that would reach the heavens. They wanted fame, they wanted security, they wanted to make a name for themselves. The project became known as Babel. Instead of destroying the tower, God confused their languages. Communication collapsed. The people scattered across the world. And at that moment, the biblical story narrows dramatically. Instead of focusing on all humanity, it focuses on one man, Abram. Living in the prosperous city of Ur, Abram received a command that would change history forever. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. No map, no destination, no guarantees. Only a promise. God promised that Abram would become the father of a great nation, and that through his descendants, all nations of the earth would be blessed. At 75 years old, Abram obeyed. He left everything familiar behind and journeyed toward Canaan. Yet the promise seemed impossible. His wife Sarah was barren. Years passed, then decades passed. Still no child. Along the way, Abram rescued his nephew Lot from invading kings and encountered the mysterious priest-king Melchizedek, a figure who appeared briefly yet left a lasting mark on biblical history. The waiting continued. Eventually, Sarah suggested a human solution. Her servant Hagar bore a son named Ishmael. But Ishmael was not the promised child. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared again. His name was changed to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. Sarai became Sarah, and God declared that the promised son would come through her. Sarah laughed at the idea. She was nearly 90 years old. Yet 1 year later, the impossible happened. Isaac was born. The child of promise had arrived. For years, Abraham watched Isaac grow. Every promise seemed to be taking shape. Then came the greatest test of his life. God commanded Abraham to take Isaac to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. The request defied logic. It threatened the very promise God had made. Yet Abraham obeyed. Father and son climbed the mountain together. Isaac carried the wood. Abraham carried the knife and fire. When Isaac asked where the sacrifice was, Abraham answered, "God will provide." At the final moment, just as Abraham prepared to obey, an angel stopped him. A ram appeared nearby and was offered instead. The promise remained intact. Years later, Sarah died. Abraham purchased a burial cave in Canaan. It became the first piece of land his family legally owned in the Promised Land. Isaac married Rebekah, and once again the family faced the familiar challenge of infertility. Eventually, twin sons were born, Esau and Jacob. The brothers could not have been more different. Esau was a hunter, Jacob was a strategist. One day, hungry and impulsive, Esau traded his birthright for a simple meal. Later, Jacob secured the blessing intended for the firstborn. Conflict exploded within the family. Jacob fled into exile. For years, he lived far from home, building a family and acquiring wealth. Yet his greatest transformation occurred during one extraordinary night. Alone beside the Jabbok River, Jacob wrestled with a mysterious figure until dawn. Neither would let go. When the struggle ended, Jacob received a new name: Israel, the one who wrestles with God. The name would eventually belong not only to a man, but to an entire nation. And from Israel's 12 sons would come the next great chapter of the story. A chapter centered on a dreamer named Joseph. Jacob, now called Israel, had 12 sons. Among them, one stood apart: Joseph. He was the first son born to Rachel, the wife Jacob loved most. Because of this, Joseph became his father's favorite. Jacob even gave him a special robe, a visible symbol of affection that his brothers could not ignore. Resentment grew quickly. Then Joseph began sharing his dreams. In one dream, his brothers' bundles of grain bowed before his own. In another, the sun, moon, and stars bowed before him. To Joseph, they were simply dreams. To his brothers, they sounded like arrogance. Hatred took root. One day, while tending flocks far from home, the brothers saw Joseph approaching in the distance. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. At first, they planned to kill him. Instead, they threw him into an empty pit and eventually sold him to traveling merchants heading toward Egypt. For 20 pieces of silver, they sold their own brother. Back home, they stained Joseph's robe with animal blood and convinced Jacob that a wild beast had killed him. The father mourned, the brothers hid their guilt, and Joseph disappeared into Egypt. There he was purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Despite being a slave, Joseph excelled at everything he did. The Bible repeatedly states a simple phrase: "The Lord was with Joseph." Soon he was entrusted with managing Potiphar's entire household. But success brought a new challenge. Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce him. Joseph refused. Humiliated, she falsely accused him of wrongdoing. Once again, Joseph lost everything. He was thrown into prison. Years passed. Yet even in prison, Joseph gained favor and responsibility. 2 royal officials arrived with troubling dreams. Joseph interpreted both correctly. One man was restored to service. The other was executed. Joseph asked the restored official to remember him. He forgot. 2 more years passed in silence. Then Pharaoh himself experienced disturbing dreams no one could explain. 7 healthy cows were devoured by 7 thin cows. 7 healthy ears of grain were consumed by 7 withered ears. Only then did the official remember Joseph. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. He explained that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. He advised Pharaoh to store grain during the good years. Pharaoh recognized Joseph's wisdom immediately. In a single day, Joseph went from prisoner to ruler. Only Pharaoh himself held more authority. For 7 years, Egypt prepared. Then the famine arrived exactly as predicted. The crisis spread far beyond Egypt. Back in Canaan, Jacob's family faced starvation. His sons traveled to Egypt to buy grain. When they arrived, they unknowingly stood before the brother they had sold decades earlier. Joseph recognized them instantly. They did not recognize him. What followed was a series of tests designed to reveal whether his brothers had changed. At last, when Judah offered himself as a substitute for Benjamin, Joseph saw genuine transformation. Unable to contain his emotions, he revealed his identity. "I am Joseph." The room fell silent. The brothers expected revenge. Instead, Joseph offered forgiveness. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Those words summarize the entire story of Genesis. Human beings make choices. Some are noble, some are terrible. Yet throughout the chaos, a larger purpose continues moving forward. Joseph invited his family to settle in Egypt. Jacob arrived with 70 relatives. What began as a single family was becoming a nation. Before his death, Jacob blessed each of his sons. One blessing stood above the rest. It was given to Judah, a promise that kings would one day arise from his line. Joseph also died in Egypt, but before his death, he made a final request. When God eventually delivered his people, Joseph wanted his bones carried back to the promised land, because he knew Egypt was not the destination. It was only the beginning of another chapter. Soon a new pharaoh would arise, and Israel's descendants would find themselves trapped in slavery. Generations passed in Egypt. The family of 70 became a vast nation, but eventually a new pharaoh rose to power. Unlike his predecessors, he did not remember Joseph. Instead of seeing the Hebrews as allies, he saw them as a threat. Fear turned into oppression. The Israelites were forced into slavery, building cities under the burning Egyptian sun. Yet despite their suffering, they continued to multiply. Pharaoh responded with a terrible decree. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile River. It was an attempt to erase an entire people. During this dark period, a child was born to a Levite family. His name was Moses. To save him, his mother placed him inside a basket and set him among the reeds of the Nile. There, Pharaoh's daughter discovered him. The child marked for death was raised in the very palace of the king who ordered his destruction. Moses grew up with the education of an Egyptian prince, but he never forgot his true identity. One day, after witnessing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, Moses killed the Egyptian and fled into exile. He escaped into the wilderness of Midian. For 40 years, he lived as a shepherd. The prince became a wanderer. Then, at 80 years old, everything changed. While tending sheep, Moses saw a bush engulfed in flames. Yet the bush was not consumed. From within the fire, God called his name. Moses, Moses. God revealed that he had heard the cries of his people and would deliver them from slavery. Moses was chosen to confront Pharaoh. Reluctant and uncertain, he protested repeatedly. But God answered every excuse. Eventually, Moses returned to Egypt alongside his brother Aaron. Their message was simple: "Let my people go." Pharaoh refused. What followed were 10 devastating plagues. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs overwhelmed the land. Gnats and flies filled the air. Livestock died. Painful boils spread across Egypt. Hail destroyed crops. Locusts consumed what remained. Darkness covered the nation. Still, Pharaoh resisted. Then came the final plague. The Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb and place its blood upon their doorposts. That night, death passed through Egypt. Every firstborn died except those protected by the blood of the lamb. This became known as Passover. At last, Pharaoh surrendered. After more than 4 centuries, the Israelites left Egypt. Yet freedom did not come easily. Soon Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued them with his army. The Israelites found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the most powerful military force in the world. Fear spread through the camp. But Moses raised his staff. A powerful wind blew through the night. The sea parted. Walls of water stood on either side as the people crossed on dry ground. When the Egyptian army followed, the waters returned. The pursuit ended forever. Israel was free. The journey then led into the wilderness. There, the people quickly discovered that freedom required faith. When food ran short, God provided manna from heaven. Every morning for 40 years, bread appeared across the desert floor. At Mount Sinai, the story reached another turning point. Thunder shook the mountain, fire and smoke surrounded its peak, and God established a covenant with Israel. The 10 Commandments became the foundation of that covenant. They defined worship, morality, justice, and community. Additional laws followed, shaping every aspect of Israelite life. A sacred tabernacle was constructed so that God's presence could dwell among his people. But while Moses received these instructions, the people grew impatient. They fashioned a golden calf and worshipped it as their god. The covenant had barely begun, yet rebellion had already returned. Still, God offered mercy. The journey continued. When spies were sent into Canaan, most returned terrified by what they saw. Only Joshua and Caleb believed the people could succeed. The nation chose fear instead of faith. As a result, an entire generation wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Even Moses would not enter the promised land. From Mount Nebo, he saw the land from afar. Then he died at the age of 120. The great deliverer had completed his mission. Now leadership would pass to Joshua, and Israel would finally enter the land promised centuries earlier to Abraham. After the death of Moses, leadership passed to Joshua. The mission remained unchanged. Israel was finally about to enter the promised land. The first obstacle stood directly ahead. The Jordan River was overflowing its banks. Yet as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the water, the river stopped flowing. The nation crossed on dry ground, just as their parents had crossed the Red Sea decades earlier. The first major city before them was Jericho. Its walls appeared impossible to overcome. Instead of launching a conventional attack, God instructed the Israelites to march around the city once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, they marched 7 times. Trumpets sounded, the people shouted, and Jericho's walls collapsed. Over the following years, Joshua led the conquest of Canaan and divided the land among the 12 tribes. Before his death, Joshua challenged the nation with a simple choice. Choose this day whom you will serve. For a time, the people remained faithful. Then history began repeating itself. The book of Judges records a cycle that lasted for centuries. The people abandoned God. Enemies invaded. The people cried out for help. God raised a deliverer. Peace returned. Then the cycle started again. Among these judges was Deborah, a courageous leader who guided Israel to victory. There was Gideon, who defeated a vast army with only 300 men. And there was Samson, blessed with extraordinary strength, but weakened by poor choices. Again and again, Israel struggled with the same problem. The issue was never military power. It was faithfulness. Eventually, the people demanded a king. They wanted to be like the surrounding nations. Despite warnings from the prophet Samuel, God allowed it. The first king was Saul, tall, impressive, and popular. At first, Saul showed promise, but pride and disobedience gradually undermined his reign. God chose another leader. A shepherd from Bethlehem. His name was David. David first entered history's spotlight when a giant warrior named Goliath challenged Israel's army. Armed with only a sling and a few stones, David stepped forward. One stone found its mark. The giant fell. The victory became one of the most famous moments in biblical history. Yet David's greatest battles still lay ahead. Saul became jealous and spent years pursuing him. David lived as a fugitive before eventually becoming king over all Israel. He established Jerusalem as the capital and united the kingdom. Most importantly, God made a covenant with David. His royal line would endure, and an eternal king would one day come from his descendants. But David was not perfect. His affair with Bathsheba and the death of her husband brought tragedy into his household. Unlike Saul, however, David repented when confronted with his sin. After David came Solomon. When given the opportunity to ask for anything, Solomon requested wisdom. God granted it abundantly. Under Solomon, Israel reached the height of its wealth and influence. He constructed the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a permanent house for worship. For a moment, it seemed as if every promise was coming together. Then Solomon repeated a familiar mistake. Power led to compromise. Foreign influences turned his heart away from complete devotion. After his death, the kingdom split in two. Israel occupied the north. Judah remained in the south. The division weakened both kingdoms. Most northern kings abandoned God's ways entirely. Southern kings alternated between reform and corruption. During this period, prophets emerged across the land. Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and demonstrated that Israel's God alone held power. Isaiah spoke of a coming servant who would suffer for others. Jeremiah warned of judgment, but also promised a future covenant written on human hearts. Again and again, the prophets called the nation back to faithfulness. Again and again, the warnings were ignored. The consequences eventually arrived. In 722 BC, Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Its people were scattered. More than a century later, Babylon turned its attention toward Judah. Jerusalem fell. The temple built by Solomon was destroyed. The people were carried away into exile. The city of David was in ruins. The throne was empty. The temple was gone. Everything appeared lost. Yet even in exile, the story was not over. Because the same God who called Abraham, delivered Moses, and established David's kingdom was still at work behind the scenes. And the final chapter of the Old Testament was about to begin. Exile was not the end. Even in Babylon, God continued to work through his people. Among the exiles was a young man named Daniel. Far from Jerusalem, far from the temple, and surrounded by foreign cultures, Daniel remained faithful. He interpreted dreams for kings, survived a night in a den of lions, and witnessed visions of future empires that would shape world history. His friends faced a fiery furnace because they refused to worship an idol. Yet they emerged unharmed. Even in a foreign land, God had not abandoned his covenant. Then history changed once again. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon. Soon afterward, he issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return home. For the first time in generations, hope returned. Groups of exiles journeyed back to Jerusalem. The city was damaged. The temple was gone. The walls lay in ruins. But rebuilding began. Ezra helped restore worship and the teaching of God's law. Nehemiah led the effort to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, despite opposition from every side. Slowly, the nation recovered. A new temple stood where Solomon's temple had once stood. Yet something was different. The glory days seemed distant. The kingdom of David had not returned. The promises still appeared unfinished. Prophets continued to speak. Haggai encouraged the people to remain faithful. Zechariah spoke of future hope. Finally came Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament. His message was both a warning and a promise. God had not forgotten his people. The story was still moving toward its destination. Then the voices stopped. For 400 years, no new prophet appeared. Empires rose and fell. Persia gave way to Greece. Greece eventually yielded to Rome. The world changed dramatically. But the promises remained. The promise given in Eden. The promise given to Abraham. The promise given through Moses. The promise given to David. All of them pointed forward. The Old Testament is not merely a collection of ancient stories. It is one continuous narrative, from creation to covenant, from failure to redemption, from promise to expectation. Every sacrifice, every prophet, every king, every victory, and every tragedy contributes to a larger story. A story that does not truly end with Malachi. It pauses. The curtain closes for a moment. The stage grows silent, and the world waits. Because the next chapter is coming, and when it arrives, it will change history forever. If you enjoyed this journey through the Old Testament, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next chapter of the story. Thank you for watching. And until next time, keep exploring history.